want to read you two poems this session, and they're both by oblates. This is one of our French oblates who's lived in northern Canada with the Dene Indians for years and years, a man called Remy Fumelot. He's a wonderful poet with a quick twist of phrase and sense of humor. And this poem is called Dene Life, and it'll speak about Sabbath. Southern tourists came up to visit the Dene, and they were impressed with what they saw. Boy, they said, you have a nice life. Open sky, pure air, immense lakes, gentle breezes, endless summer days, clear water, delicious fish, game in the bush, wild ducks, geese, firewood everywhere. In your way of life, sharing habits, elders' wisdom, carefree children, friendliness towards everyone, working only when you like. Our life in the South is hard. We're forever worrying about timers and laws and fences and regulations and gang wars and organized crime and traffic jams and long hours of commuting and mortgages and interest rates and political games. Do you like your way of life, they said to the Dene? We don't know, they said. We've never had anything worse to compare it to. Okay. Okay, we want to look at celebrating Sabbath, and I want to center in this session on what does it mean to celebrate Sabbath biblically. And I call it showing up for the wedding feast and taking the ointment. I want to begin with Jesus as we try to nail down what is Sabbath. So this hour I want to talk about Jesus' invitation, then our resistance to the invitation, and then how Jesus demonstrates what we should do, and then a little bit how we get over some of our resistances. So first of all, Jesus' invitation. Central to all the Gospels, in all the Gospels, central to Christ's message is an invitation to come to the wedding banquet. And we're going to look at what that means. What is the wedding banquet? Okay. So that it's central. Christ comes, and in fact, all the parables, scholars will tell you, all the parables are handwritten invitations to leave one way of life, which is, I'm in the rut, and this is the way life is, and I'm protesting my life right to despair, and to come to the wedding banquet. Let me just give you two texts, which are, both critical texts. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the key parable of Jesus is the parable of the king throwing the wedding banquet. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king. The king obviously is God, who decided to throw a wedding banquet for his son. The son obviously is Christ, okay? And so he sent the messengers out to bring in the invited guests. They went to the first person and said, the king's banquet is ready, come. And he says, I want to, but I can't because I've just got married. And the implication is once, I get settled in my new way of life, I will come. They get to the second one. They said, the king's wedding banquet is ready. Come to the feast. Said, I've just bought a yoke of oxen, and as soon as I've tested them, I will come. They came to the third man. They said, the king's banquet feast is ready. Come to the feast. They said, I've just bought some land. I need to measure it. And after that, the implication is I'll come to the feast. So they went back to the king and said, the invited guests aren't ready to come. They said, then the king got angry, and he said, none of them will taste my wedding feast. Go instead to the highways and byways, to the poor, and compel them to come in. So they go to the highways and byways, they invite the poor, and then the poor come and they fill the wedding banquet, they fill the hall up right to its brim. But the story isn't over yet. Now they're celebrating the wedding banquet, and the poor are there, but notice the other people didn't come, the invited guests. But the king comes in, and there's a single man there without a wedding garment. And he says to him, how did you get in here? And then before he gets a chance to say anything, the king says, throw him out into the exterior darkness, where there will be mourning and weeping and grinding of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. End of the banquet, end of the parable. It's quite a story. Okay, let's dissect that a little bit. First of all, that's the central parable. There's a feast going on at the heart of life. There's Sabbath going on at the heart of life. We're invited into the banquet hall, into the garden with the king, okay? Now, he sends the messengers out to invite the invited guests to come, and three of them, and they typify us, the invited guests, and none of them comes. But notice each of them, they have an excuse. They're coming, but not yet. Okay. And then the king shuts the door on them. The king says, they're not coming. Close the door and get other people to come. Now we must stop and look at that. Why? Isn't there some harshness in there? Like they were intending to come and, they get this chance and they don't come. And so he says, no, they're not coming. Why does urgency? You have all these parables of urgency. You got to come to the banquet, you got to come now. Okay. Well, it's not so much that the king shuts the door. Okay. It's this. In fact, there's a powerful challenge in there. What prevents us from moving to a different way of life? What prevents us from entering Sabbath? What prevents us from just leaving the rut of our lives? It's not that we don't want to, and it's not that we don't even intend to, but not yet. See, notice each of them, they're going to do it, but not yet. I first need to measure land. Then I need to test the oxen. Then I need to get married. That's the way our lives are. We spend most of our lives tuning up, getting ready, any day now. Some years ago, a man wrote a book which I very much liked, a man called Clyde Reed, and he called it Celebrate the Temporary. Reed says, you know what our struggle is? He says, we always have an excuse for not yet. So we say, well, I'll do it, but after my eczema clears up, after my mother dies, after the bills are paid, when I'm not so tired anymore, after I have my knee surgery, after the cancer treatment, after the bill is paid, after this, after I graduate, and we spend our whole lives, there's always something. There's always an unpaid bill, there's always a sick mother, there's always something. So our lives come and go and we're still waiting. And Jesus says, you're going to be waiting your whole life. If you don't drop it right now and do it right now, you'll never do it. John Shea tells a story. He said he was preaching in a church once on this, and he said, the urgency, you got to do it now. He said, a man got up, walked out of church. And so he thought, well, you win some, you lose some. But the next day the man phoned him. He said, Father, the reason I walked out of church, not because I didn't like your homily. I liked it a lot. He said, I understood it immediately. He said, I was angry at my brother. We haven't talked for 12 years. And I walked out of church and went to the closest payphone. I phoned him. And last night we got together because I knew if I didn't do it right then, an hour later I'd have an excuse. See, if we don't do it now, we're never going to do it. Okay? See, we all want to go to the wedding feast, but not yet. Remember Augustine's famous prayer when he was in these years after his conversion, but before he could get his sex life into order? He'd go out and he'd say, Lord, make me a good and a chaste Christian, but not yet. See, we say that prayer in all kinds of ways. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to the wedding feast, but not yet. Just after exams, after this, and so on. Well, life comes and life goes, and we're still waiting. Okay. Now, then we pick up the story. He said, go out to the poor. And they go out to the poor. And notice the poor have no resistance. They come to the wedding banquet, and they fill the hall. Why do the poor go? You'd think the rich would go. Well, this isn't abstract. Why did the poor go? Precisely because they are poor and they have nothing on. You know, if on an ordinary workday, just take this scenario. On an ordinary workday, you walk out of your office to have a 10, 15-minute break, you get a little bit of air, and just when you come out there with a bunch of your fellow workers and so on, somebody comes along and says, the mayor of St. Louis has free beer and pizza downtown for 2 hours this afternoon. How many of us could go? I bet you not a single one of us could go. Well, you'd have had to tell me a couple of days ago, I got to clear some time. Not today. How many of the poor you think would go? They'd all go. There's nothing wrong. This is great. Free beer and pizza. They'd drop everything. See, the poor are free. We're not free. We're not free to go to the banquet. Precisely because we're rich. That's why Jesus says, riches block you from the kingdom. The poor have nothing on. We say, well, it's easy for them. They haven't got anything on. Well, that's the whole point. That's the point that it stretches us. I remember and how hard that hit me. I was driving out one night when I was living in Edmonton to give a talk just on this parable, you know. And I was a little late because I was busy and I'd left a little late. And as I'm driving on the highway, somebody has some trouble and this woman's in a ditch with a car and so on. And I thought, I don't have time to stop. I have to go out and talk about this. You know, like somebody else has to stop. You know, see, I'm not poor. I had a talk to give. You know, there were people waiting. Somebody else, you know, he's got nothing else to do. May as well stop. See, the gospel indicts us. But the reason why what blocks us from Sabbath, we're too busy. We got things on. Not yet. I'm going to do it, but not quite yet. Okay. Then when he gets to the banquet hall and the man without the wedding garment will come back on him. We won't forget about him and why he gets cast into the exterior darkness, and also why you don't get to hear his excuse. It's interesting. Have you ever wondered why he didn't have a wedding garment on? Did he forget? Did they run out? Was the invitation wrong? You're never going to get to hear his explanation, and we'll see why. Okay, let's first see. But Jesus, at the heart of life lies the wedding feast that the king has called, and we're invited there. We have all these excuses not to go. Now, in John's gospel, that is given in that magnificent text about the wedding feast of Cana. That's a text that has about 2 or 3 levels to it. And we always get the first level, that's normally the level we preach on, that this is a hospitality miracle. Jesus and his mother go to Cana, they run out of wine, the mother prompts the son a bit, he takes the wine, the water changes into wine and so on, and it's hospitality. It is that. That's not the deepest part of the text. Let's look at that text, which first of all is a text about Mary, more than about Jesus. Because the text says the mother of Jesus was invited to a wedding, and Jesus also went along. Notice who this story is about. Jesus is the extra in the text, okay? Now, but that's a significant expression. The mother of Jesus, in the 4th gospel, in John's gospel, Mary is never named. If you didn't have the other gospels, you wouldn't know what her name is. And she's always called the mother of Jesus, or she's called woman. And there's a reason for that. Because in the 4th gospel, Mary functions as Eve. She is the mother of humanity. She's your mother, she's Jesus' mother, she's everybody's mother, and she's Eve. She's Mother Nature, she's Mother everything. And so the words coming out of her mouth are going to be very significant. It's not just a woman talking to her son. This is the mother of humanity talking to God. Because in John's gospel, Jesus is God. He comes down from heaven and so on. So the dialogue is the mother of humanity talking to God. Okay, and so the mother of humanity is invited to a wedding, and God was there. Also shows up. She comes to the wedding, and at the peak of the wedding, suddenly she comes to her son and says, "Son, they have no wine." And he says, "Woman," never called my mother that, you know. He doesn't say mom. He says, "Woman, what's that to you and I? My hour hasn't come." Now, let's look at what she's asking. The mother of humanity. She's talking to God. She, first of all, it's at a wedding. It's very significant. Wedding, I haven't said this yet. You know, all great fairy tales and all archetypal literature has to end with a wedding. Because that's what's happening ultimately inside of God. Inside of God, wedding is taking place, okay? But weddings aren't abstract. Weddings are about dancing and food and life and coming together and wine drinking with an undertow of sex there and so on. That's at the heart of life, okay? The mother of humanity is at one of these occasions. She comes to her son, who's God, and says, "They have no wine." That's a stunning expression, you know. This isn't just about, you know, the caterer came up short, okay? It's much deeper than that. What is wine? Well, how would that line be different if she came and says, "You know, son, I was checking in the fridge. There's nothing healthy to eat in this house. There's no alfalfa, there's no celery, there's no protein. They just got junk food and Pepsi in their fridge, you know." See, notice wine is not a protein. Wine is not a necessity. Wine is not a sustenance food. Wine is about celebration. Wine's about something extra. Wine's about warming the heart and dancing and other things. So she's saying, they got sustenance here. They don't have any. There's nothing extra. There's nothing bubbly. There's nothing at the heart of life. It's flat, you know. They have a house, but it's flat. They have a marriage, but it's flat. There's no wine. There's a meeting going on here, but it's flat. There's no wine there, you know. Then Jesus says, so that's what she's asking. There's something flat. It's the mother of humanity speaking to God. Says, you know, I'm living on this planet. It's pretty dead. Right at the center where it should be bubbling over with a little bit of life. It's pretty dead and depressed down here, you know. Then Jesus says, what's that to you and to I? He says, my hour hasn't come. And it takes us a little further in the text than we need to go. But when he says my hour hasn't come, he doesn't mean the hour for my miracles to happen. He's not saying, you know, the Father and I have a schedule and miracles are really third year. No. The hour he refers to is the hour of his suffering. said, I'm not sure should be doing this miracle because I haven't put my own life on the line yet. You're going to see what makes the wine isn't the person who has the best sense of humor and tells the best jokes or sings the loudest. The person who makes wine and puts bubbles at the center is the person who's suffering and dying for the community. And that's why Jesus is reluctant to do this. Interesting enough, John doesn't call it a miracle, he calls it a sign. So this was the first sign that Jesus did, because miracles tend to be, it is a miracle, but when you think of a miracle, something that's clear cut. See a sign you have to think about and you wonder, and what does it mean, and so on. Jesus wants us to really think about this one. But the key thing I want to bring out is, notice at the center there's wedding. And weddings have to have wine. And the mother of humanity is telling God, I'm down on this planet, and it's not that alive. It should be. They're having weddings, but there's no dance. There's no real, They have families, and we have life, and we eat meals, but there's no wine. There's something flat at the heart of life. See, and the heart of life is not supposed to be flat, as we'll see. Now, so I gave you from the 4 Gospels, that beautiful text in John about the wedding feast of Cana, and then in the Synoptic Gospels, the kingdom of heaven is this banquet. We're invited to the banquet, we're invited and notice it's a wedding banquet, male and femaleness coming together inside of God, and so on. Now, before we get to what constitutes that and how Jesus defines it, some of our innate and habitual hesitancies to celebrate. As I said this morning, we want solitude. We just never get there. We want celebration. We desperately want wine in our lives. Why don't we ever get there? Or why do we so seldom get there? 3 reasons. The first one we've just looked at, and I'll just mention it here. Our busyness and self-preoccupation. We're always too busy. I'd like to go on vacation. I don't have time. I'd like to take time off in the evening, take a walk in nature, but I don't have time. Or I'm not in the right mood for it. I'm too depressed. We're asleep out of depression. We're too busy. So it's our busyness and self-preoccupation. But it's not the only culprit. Also, our innate and inherited guilt complexes. And we're going to look at that, and I'll come back at the end of this talk. I want to talk about how do we shed guilt complexes. And don't even feel bad. We all have them. It's part of being sensitive in life. If you're a sensitive person, you're going to have guilt complexes, and you don't get them from religion either. We have this humor among ourselves and banter. Catholics think we invented guilt. Presbyterians think they invented guilt. Lutherans think they invented guilt. Remember I have a Presbyterian friend. He says, I always get fed up with Catholics. Catholic guilt. He says, you're amateurs. You don't even know what you're doing. He said, I grew up Presbyterian. He said, we can do guilt well. He said, you were allowed to dance and drink and go to Vegas and so on. We didn't do any of this stuff. He said, there's really only one Catholic sin. Catholics don't have to feel guilty about sex. And then we're liberated and everything else, Some of these poor Protestants, they feel guilty about everything, Well, actually, everybody feels guilty about everything. See, there's an innate guilt complex inside of all of us that is simply, we inherit it, and you're going to see why. Because it's a healthy instinct that's asking you to do something else. That guilt complex is partly it's an innate and it's a healthy thing, asking you to do love and sacrifice properly. And that's inside of everybody for a good reason. But then we are also, that is fed and heightened to pathological degrees oftentimes by what Freud called the superego. And the superego is all the things we're made to feel shame and guilt about as little children, and so on. From the first time you acted out in the high chair and you threw Jell-O around the room because you felt really good, and some adult said, shut up, don't eat like a little pig, See, we get shamed in our enthusiasm, and slowly that becomes the superego that Freud talks about. Well, good people don't do that. And after a while, we feel guilty kind of about breathing and about most other things. So we have these guilt complexes. We're going to come back on, I want to do a bigger piece just on the nature of guilt, where it comes from and how we get rid of it. But here I just want to name it. But it inhibits us. That's why we have this feeling, we sometimes laugh about it, but it's not funny. And that is, whenever you're feeling good, you feel guilty about feeling good. And after a while, you feel so guilty about feeling you're not feeling good anymore. Yeah. you know. Or when you walk away from somebody's hospital bed, they're sick and you're well, and you walk out of the room and you feel really guilty because you're healthy, you know. Well, Jesus would say, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty at all. Remember that beautiful text where he says, why should my disciples fast? The bridegroom is still with them. By the bridegroom, he means himself, but he means something much more. The bridegroom is also the season of wedding. Jesus said, soon enough, the bridegroom will be taken from them. You'll have lots of time to fast. That translates into, if you're walking away from somebody's hospital bed, they're dying of cancer, and you feel guilty about feeling well, Jesus says, don't feel guilty at all. The bridegroom will soon enough taken away, which means soon enough you'll be lying in bed, and they'll be walking away from your bed. He said, your day will come. Relax. You know, enjoy your health. That's the season of the bridegroom. It's fragile. It's temporary. Soon enough, it'll be taken from you. You know, don't second guess your seasons of celebration, your seasons of health, your seasons of love, your seasons of ecstasy, your seasons of wine drinking, your seasons of friendship by saying, well, I shouldn't feel this good. He said, soon enough, you'll be deprived of it. We'll all get our cold, lonely, sick seasons, and we're all going to die someday. Soon enough, the bridegroom will be taken away. Don't feel guilty when you're feeling good. You know, we'll see that Jesus models that for us. And then the third reason, our third hesitancy, beyond our guilt and our narcissism and pragmatism and so on, is the tiredness of non-forgiveness and our perennially protesting our right to despair. What do I mean by that? Remember last night when I introduced this, I said one of the things Sabbath is meant to do, Sabbath is meant to bring in the statute of limitations, to give up on grudges and bitterness and wounds. In the end, they tire us. They tire us. And what they do inside of us, because they're real, you know, we've all really been hurt. Okay, it's not a question of have you been hurt, it's only a question of how much have you been hurt and how you cope with it. Everybody's been hurt. You know, they used to say the age of reason is 7. I will say try about 37 or 47. That's about the time we get our lives in hand, but by the time you get your life in hand, you no longer have a full deck of cards. You know, you've been hurt and wounded and dropped and everything else, and so by the time you get to own yourself, you're not playing with a full deck. You know, and I'm glad you're laughing because you know exactly what I mean, okay? See, and then the danger is we protest our right to despair. If you knew how bad it was, and I have a right to be unhappy. I have a right to be angry. I have a right to, no, and you do. Actually, we do, you know. There's real reasons, you know, life hasn't been fair. Now, where that's illustrated in scriptures, let's go back to our man. The king comes into the room, and there's a man in there who hasn't got a wedding garment on. And he says, how did you get in here? And then before he has a chance to answer, that's implied in the text, before he gets to make an excuse, throw him out. Before he makes an excuse, into the exterior darkness, there'll be warning and weeping and grinding of teeth. Okay, that's this part of the text. Jesus is saying, you know, there comes a time when, you know, why don't we hear this man's excuse? Because it's not going to be heard. You know, when we protest our right to despair, at a certain point, nobody is hearing us. The reason why we don't hear him is because at a certain point, it's not to be heard. He is mourning and weeping and grinding his teeth. And actually, that's it's a figurative picture. It's one of the images for hell in the New Testament. You know, see, hell, in the New Testament, there's all kinds of images. Hellfire, there's the valley of Gehenna, and there's the worms. And one of them is mourning and weeping and grinding your teeth. That's when we're going through life and, you know, we're literally just, the world's rotten. I never got a break. George Bush is a jerk. Governments are wrong. Judges, the judicial system, the church is bad. So we're grinding our teeth. And Jesus says, nobody's hearing. Nobody's hearing. The wedding feast is right there. We just have to go and celebrate. Just put on the wedding garment. That's an image of somebody pouting at a party. I'm at a party. And see, I have no wedding garment on. That's just the imagery. That's the person who's at the wedding feast, but they're pouting. You know, I have a right to be unhappy. You know, Jesus, you do, but you know something? Nobody's hearing it after a while. After a while, when you're little kids, you can do that. You know, as a little kid, you get into a sulk and you go into your room. Eventually, mommy will come in and get you. and say, okay, it's not that bad, and so on. When you get to be about 50, after a while, nobody's going to come into the room and get you, you know. See, then you'll just be there mourning and weeping and grinding your teeth. And if you knew my life, and I have a right to be unhappy, and this happened to me, and I'm from a dysfunctional family, we all are, you know. That's true. I'm not just make that humorously. You know, it's not a question of, is your family dysfunctional? All families are dysfunctional. So that's the only thing that's wrong with this literature. It's not that it isn't right, but they imply that somewhere there are functional families and functional parishes and functional churches and functional organizations. There aren't any. It's only a question of how bad is yours, you know? And how do you cope? And how do you find wedding inside of that? You know, you're never going to find a perfect family, a perfect church, a perfect spouse, a perfect anybody, you know? Not this side of eternity. And see, and then we can go through grinding our teeth, you know. I'm in the wrong place, and I'm an oblate, and they always send me to the wrong places. I'm living with this community, and you know, and I didn't get the right formation, and the other guys got to go to Rome, and I didn't get to go to Rome, and this didn't happen, and so on. See, that works for a while, but after a while, nobody is hearing, you know. And we're mourning and weeping and grinding our teeth. See, we're protesting our right to despair. And the answer for that is we got to forgive. We don't have to just forgive people. We have to forgive, ultimately, God. We got to forgive, you know, ourselves for our mistakes and the people who have hurt us, and ultimately we got to forgive God so we don't die bitter and angry, which is ultimately the only imperative there is in life. There's only one imperative. You don't want to die with a mad on. You don't want to die angry, you know. And if we're not careful, we will, because we've all been mishandled and dropped and whatever. Life didn't turn out fair for anybody. Maybe for George Clooney, but not for anybody else. Okay. And, you know, and the rest of us, we're at this anger. See, that's what tired us, and that's what keeps us in the banquet. I could celebrate, except I'm hurt. Except this happened to me, and that happened to me. And if you knew my family, and if you knew my marriage, and if you knew this, my church, and so on, I can't celebrate. Not now, when this clears up. See, it's non-forgiveness blocks us from the banquet. Okay, now what is the banquet? Okay, I first want to talk a little bit about archetypes, but then the central piece I want to give you is from Jesus. Okay, but archetypally, that's called going into the garden. Okay, and the more I study archetypes, the more I like the expression of gardens. Notice, and you have a lot of archetypes in Scripture. Notice where Adam and Eve are living at the beginning. Paradise is what? It's a garden. It's the Garden of Eden. And in the Garden of Eden, they were naked and didn't know it. They walked around. They could eat all the fruits. They had this innocence and so on. There was no work done in the garden. Okay. Where does Jesus sweat blood? In the Garden of Gethsemane. You know, that's very significant. If I can do a little side point here. It's very significant. Notice he doesn't sweat blood in the temple. He doesn't sweat blood in the synagogue. He doesn't sweat blood in the desert or on the plain or the mountain. That would mean something else. You know, he sweats blood in the garden. Gardens are for lovers. And so he sweats blood not as a high priest or as a shepherd or as a magus or as a redeemer. He sweats blood as a lover. It's Christ the lover who's sweating blood. Let me tell you how important that is. And I don't want to wrap this guy because otherwise it's a pretty good movie. But how many of you saw the movie The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson? Now, interesting, that is a good work of art. Mel Gibson's a good artist. And as a work of art, that's a great piece of art. Does it nail the passion? No. Why not? And I'm not just saying this, you know, bias for or against it. See, what Mel Gibson chose to emphasize in that movie is the physical suffering of Christ. So that's pretty graphic, and the physical suffering of Christ must have been pretty graphic. But why do I say it's not, he didn't get it right? Because when you read all four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, notice they never emphasize the physical suffering of Christ. In fact, they hardly mention it. John's Gospel is hardly mentioned. In Mark's Gospel, the entire crucifixion scene is one line. They led him away and crucified him. See, they're not focusing on the nails, the ropes, the whippings, which must have been, you know, he had him scourged, bingo, you know. Why not? Because that's not what they want you to focus on. What they do emphasize in all those long chapters of the Passion is what's happening inside of Christ. Christ the lover. He's betrayed, alone, lonely. Nobody stands up for him. And notice before his passion, what's Christ afraid of? The ropes? No, he says, you're going to betray me. I'm going to be alone. I'm going to be humiliated, hung out to dry. This is a drama of a lover, not of a physical athlete. See, we've often turned Christ into a physical athlete. Look at the suffering he endured for us. If that had been the case, it would have been the agony in the desert and the agony in the synagogue. But gardens are for lovers. And it's really clear it's Jesus, the lover, who's suffering. You know, he's the person who calls you into the garden. Gardens are places of love. After the resurrection, in John's gospel, first of all, in all the gospels, where is Jesus buried? In a garden. Okay? And he's buried in a virgin tomb. Why? Because he came from a virgin womb. And then he's buried in a garden because that's where lovers go. And so Mary Magdalene, the great lover, where does she go to look for Jesus? In a garden. And where does she find him? In the garden. See, archetypally, gardens, that's where you go to drink wine. That's where you go to make love. That's where you go to have friendship. That's where you have weddings. Weddings happen in gardens. And see, archetypally, we're always invited to the garden. The next time you go on vacation, no matter where it is, don't say I'm going on vacation, I'm going to Disney, I'm going to the garden. or if you go out to have a fine meal someplace in some restaurant, something with friends, we're going to the garden. Okay, see, that's another image for Sabbath. Work stops. You're there for no good reason other than to enjoy yourself completely, fully. You go to the garden. Okay, but the next time you eat the Passion, take that into account. It's really clear. The Passion begins with Jesus sweating blood in the garden. Christ the lover. Remember the Ursuline sisters who taught me catechism, they were wonderful women. They didn't always have wonderful theology, but they were wonderful women, you know. I remember one of the sisters telling us, said, you know why Jesus was sweating blood in the garden? It's because he was God, and even though he was going to suffer and die with this horrific suffering, he knew a lot of people weren't going to appropriate his sufferings and so on. Well, that is a wonderful, wonderful, pious thought that has nothing to do with the Gospels. It's not Jesus, God, who's sweating blood there. It's Jesus, the lover, the lonely man, hung out to dry. You'll all betray me. There'll be nobody there for me. In fact, Mark's Gospel has a cute little incident there. You know, in Mark's Gospel, because Jesus has been saying, you're all going to betray me. You're all going to betray me. Everybody will abandon me. Well, they come out of the garden, and this young man appears who you've never met before, the guy they call the streaker in Scripture. Remember, this young guy appears. You don't know who he is. He comes out of nowhere, and he's dressed in a shroud. See, a shroud is a burial piece. So he comes to Jesus and says, I know you're going to die, and I'm ready to bury with you. They might all abandon you, but I will stay with you to death and to show you I'm already dressed in my burial shroud. Well, he lasts about 2 minutes. The first soldiers come. He panics. They said they tried to grab him by his shroud, and he ran off naked into the night. Why naked? Okay. Well, in Mark's Gospel, the beginning of the Gospel, when Jesus is at the peak of his ministry, Mark says they were leaving everything to follow him. Boats, occupations, families, they were just abandoning everything to follow Jesus. Now when he most needs them, they're leaving everything, even their clothes, to get away from him. You know? See, this is the abandoned lover in the garden. He's going to be alone. And this is going to be a moral, psychological, emotional drama, not a physical drama. Jesus wasn't a physical athlete. He was an emotional, moral athlete. Okay, and that takes place in the garden. But see, the garden is the Sabbath, where you're invited. See, in the garden, in your life of intimacy and so on, you're going to have ecstasy, and you're also going to have agony. See, the garden becomes the place of ecstasy. The garden is also the place of agony. Scholars will tell you this. If any text is in all four Gospels, it's a really, really important text. I'm not just making this up, because even the birth of Christ isn't in all four Gospels. See, now this text is in all four Gospels, and we rarely preach a lot on it, because we don't know what to do with this text. And it's a bit of a scandalous text, but this is the central text for Sabbath. Okay, it's Jesus truly illustrating Sabbath. And I'm going to give you the text. I'm going to put the four accounts together and bring in all the imagery, because the imagery is very important. The imagery is meant to shock and scandalize you. Okay, this imagery is going to be as raw and as shocking as can be written. Okay, and it works this way. They said, one night Jesus was at the supper of a rich person. He wasn't dining at McDonald's that night. Okay, and into this banquet comes a woman who is a known prostitute in the town. It's an image of wastefulness. This woman has wasted her love. Okay, and she's carrying in her hand an alabaster jar. Alabaster was the most expensive thing you could buy in terms of like Waterford crystal. So this wasn't styrofoam she was carrying, okay? And it was full of spikenard ointment, the most expensive ointment you could buy, wasteful, expensive, lavish. Then she comes and she breaks the jar. It's an image of wastefulness. It can only be used once. You buy a Waterford crystal, but you're only going to use it once. She smashes the jar so it can never be used again. She wants to use it only once. And she poured the entire jar of ointment on Christ's feet, and the aroma and perfume filled the entire room. So they all smell this wonderful smell and scent. Then she began to weep on his feet and to dry his feet with her hair. Now you can't write imagery that's rawer than that. See, it's meant to shock and grab you. And then people were uncomfortable. People got uncomfortable, and they said, this shouldn't be happening. She shouldn't be touching him. She's a prostitute. He shouldn't have her at his feet. Judas is there, and Judas, makes the social justice comment. That ointment was expensive. It could have been sold, and the money could have been given to the poor. We shouldn't be enjoying our Christmas dinner today. There's people starving in Ethiopia. Okay, and then everybody's uncomfortable except Jesus and the woman. So Jesus reads their thoughts, and he said, leave her alone. She has just anointed me for my impending death. The poor you'll always have with you, but you won't always have me. And from now on, whenever my story is told, her story will also be told. Let's unpackage that. When Jesus says, leave her alone, she's just anointed me for my impending death. Again, all those texts cut at different levels. In essence, there's something preemptive. She's in a certain sense embalming his body before he dies. That's there. It's not the deepest part of the text. But he's saying this. When he's saying she's anointed me for my impending death, he's also saying this. When I come to die, I'm going to be more ready to die, because tonight, of all nights of my life, I'm fully alive. This is what the kingdom is really all about. Let me try to interpret that with a story. If you've ever read a book by John Powell, not John Paul, but John Powell, who is a psychologist in Chicago, and about 15 years ago he was writing all these wonderfully, and they were wonderful little books, popularized things. And one of them was a book called Unconditional Love. And it's a story of a young student he was teaching at Loyola called Tommy, who died at age 24 of cancer. And he tells the story of this young boy who was in his class. And he said, as this boy was dying of cancer, he came to John Powell's office one day and he says, Father, he said, I want to talk to you before I die, because you once said something that's made it easier for me to die at 24. He said, you maybe forgot about it, but in your class, said you once said, you said there are only two potential tragedies in life, and dying young isn't one of them. He said these are the two tragedies. If you live and you don't love, you'll never be ready to die. But equally important, you have to tell those people that you love them. You got to express your love. You got to express it to them. He said, when I found out I had cancer, terminal cancer, he said, I have a close family, I have close friends that I've spent these months telling them how important they are. He said, and now I'm ready. He said, people say, what's it like being 24 and dying? And I say, it beats being 50 and having no values. He said, tell that to the world. There's only two potential tragedies, and dying young isn't one of them. If you live and don't love, or if you live and never express your love. Now, back to Jesus with the woman at his feet, okay? Jesus is saying, now when I come to die, I'm going to be more ready, because this is the center of life, giving and receiving affection. And she's done it to me before I die. Now this is the little hook to it, you know. When do we all get the most flowers we've ever gotten? When we're dead. You know, you could spend 40 years of your life and nobody ever sends you a flower. Then you die and they drench the coffin in the dirt, they got flowers and so on. Jesus is saying, no, you want to put flowers on people's tables while they're alive. You want to put perfume on people's feet when they're alive, not after they're dead. See, he said, she's anointed me, she's got it right. But also for Jesus, see, that's the Sabbath. They were doing what we were doing. This shouldn't be happening. See, the guilt inside of them was somehow, this can't be right. Jesus says, no, it's real right. This is really, really right. Don't feel guilty. Take that ointment. The ointment has to be taken. Don't second guess life. But we know someday we're going to die and there's going to be poor and so on. No, when it's Christmas, celebrate Christmas. Remember one year at a Christmas table, my brother, bless him for it, we're having a Christmas dinner and he says, we should feel guilty about that. There's people starving in Ethiopia. Well, on another day that may be right. On Christmas Day, someone would say, no, not today. Ethiopia you'll always have with you, but today is Christmas. And you eat your Christmas dinner, and then on Good Friday, then you talk about that. See, there's a day for that. You know, or even I have friends who do this, and they do it every year. They'll send me a Christmas card. Let the peace of Christmas disturb you. Now I send it back and say, no, send it to me on Good Friday. You know, that's not what Christmas is about. You know, Carl Rahner once says, Christmas is the one day where God gives you permission to be happy. Take it. See, Good Friday is the day where, it's got to really disturb you. And the irony is oftentimes we can't celebrate Christmas very well because out of guilt, then we get to Good Friday. We don't want to celebrate Good Friday either. Say, well, it's more, but I don't want to get into that. Okay. Well, cheer up. That's also biblical. Remember when they come to Jesus and they say, why do the disciples of John fast and your own disciples don't fast? Jesus said, why should they fast? The bridegroom is still with them. Someday the bridegroom will take it away. They'll have lots of time to fast. And he said, you know what you're like? You're like little children in the market squares who said, we sang wedding songs and you wouldn't dance, funeral dirges and you wouldn't cry. John's in the desert preaching repentance and eating grasshoppers, and you say he's possessed. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and you say, woe, a wino and a glutton. Let's go to these little children in the market squares. You know, he's referring to something that happened there. Kids used to play two games in the market squares. They would play wedding and they would play funeral. So sometimes they'd play little pipes, they'd dance, and they'd have a mock wedding. And other days they'd play funeral, they'd bury a little box, and they'd play dirges and pretend to be crying and so on. But being little kids, they fought a lot. When some wanted to play funeral, the others said, no, we want to play wedding. When some wanted to play wedding, the others wanted to play funeral. Well, that's the way we get Good Friday and Christmas always mixed up, you know. See, Christmas Day, let the peace of Christ disturb you. There's people starving in Ethiopia today. I don't want to do that, you know. Then Good Friday, no, this is just morbid. We should put on white and be happy, you know. Well, no. There's a day to play wedding and there's a day to play funeral. And usually when we have trouble playing one, we have trouble playing either. I remember giving a talk once, and the man came up after and says, well, that gets me perfectly. He says, I go to church, and our church says, there's sometimes they'll sing this song, the Irish piece, Lord of the Dance. He says, I get so angry, I want to walk out of church, what has that got to do with church? Lord of the Dance, but when they sing sad songs, I don't like it either. So then I wish they were singing Lord of the Dance, See, he has trouble handling Christmas, and he has trouble handling Good Friday. Jesus didn't have trouble handling either. Notice here, Jesus flat out scandalizes people by his capacity to enjoy, and to enjoy without guilt. He says, don't ruin this moment. You're not going to guilt me out of this. This is wonderful. Wine, love, everything, it's flowing. I'm not going to feel guilty. This is the central life that prepares you for heaven. It also prepares you to die. Then when we come to die, the hardest part, there's going to be many hard parts, the letting go, the saying goodbye, but a lot of times the hardest part is, if only I had time to, I wish I had enjoyed all this stuff. I wish I had done this. Jesus, enjoy it when it's there. That's the Sabbath moment. And Jesus Jesus scandalized people by his capacity simply to enjoy. And notice, it doesn't seem he had a reputation as much of an ascetic, because they said John the Baptist is in the desert eating grasshoppers and preaching repentance. You say he's possessed. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and you say, whoa, a wino and a glutton. They were saying that about Jesus. His capacity to enjoy meals and so on seemed it had scandalized people a little bit. A Messiah should have been more like John the Baptist. See, John the Baptist was really clean in the sense. John the Baptist was an Essene, and the Essenes were a very severe sect. So they were celibates. They never went close to women. They lived in the desert. They stayed out of cities. They didn't wear nice clothes. They wore rough clothing. They were vegetarians except for grasshoppers. They didn't drink wine. They were very, very strict. Now notice Jesus was the great prophet, but he never stood out by his clothing, by his eating habits. He went into all the bars of his time, except he didn't sin. But he was able to enjoy life. John the Baptist was a prophet. He said, no, that's for later in the kingdom. You can't enjoy life now. Okay, there was no Sabbath in John's life. There was plenty of Sabbath in Jesus' life. But just take that text on the ointment. That's the great challenge. That to be able to go into the garden, to be able to go into enjoyment, to be able to express love, to receive love, to drink wine, to be without guilt. Someone says, you shouldn't be feeling as good. Said, yes, I should. and soon enough, the bridegroom will be taken from you. Don't second guess joyous moments. Don't ruin your Christmas by saying Good Friday is coming. It'll come soon enough. When you're Christmas dinner, you're at Christmas dinner. When you're drinking wine with a friend, you're drinking wine with a friend. When you're healthy and you feel the health of your body, enjoy it. It'll soon enough be gone. If your body's beautiful and you look in the mirror and say, God, it's great to look like that, enjoy it. Soon enough, it'll be taken away from you. Beauty, joy, wine, it has to be honored. It's a gift from God. It's Sabbath, and it's temporary. So Jesus shows the example there. Then, psychologically, psychologists have a word that I very much like. They call it free sense. And free sense isn't quite the same thing as recreation. See, there's different words, recreation. I remember going to a workshop once on, and the guy who advertised it actually was a wonderful workshop. He called it on personal ecology. Personal ecology. How do you take care of yourself, And so we had to fill out these charts, Do you exercise regularly? How many nights a week do you have a glass of wine? What are your exercise? How many hours of work do you work, and so on. Well, we get to one point, he asked this one guy in the group, he said, this guy said, I recreate a lot because I jog every day. And the person doing the workshop said, no, he said, that's maintenance. That's not recreation. That's very important, but you're maintaining your body. Jogging isn't necessarily Sabbath. He said, what you need in your life is free sense. Free sense, as opposed to maintenance. Say, you exercise every day. It's wonderful. But that's not Sabbath. That's maintaining. That's part of your work schedule. That's part of maintaining the health of your body. When you're drinking wine, you're also maintaining the health of your body in a little different way. See, free sense, that's anything you do that recreates your spirit. It might be writing poetry. It might be drawing a picture even though you're not so good at it. It might be drinking wine. It might be just taking a walk. It might be talking to your mother on the phone. But something you do simply because it recreates your spirit. Creative things. And it might even be hard work. It might be gardening. Maybe you're out there really working hard and you're doing something hard physically, but it's recreating your spirit. And he calls that free sense. It's free. You're doing it for no pragmatic reason. William Stafford, the poet, who had some wonderful images, and then he always tell people, he says, you should get up every morning and write a poem. He said, I do it. He said, I get every morning and I write a poem. One woman said, how do you do that? I couldn't do that. I'm not inspired every morning. He said, lower your standards. Okay, so do something free sense, gardening, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be good. See, with creativity, and young Thomas More, that wonderful writer that does books and soulmates and so on, when he does stuff on creativity, he points it out. See, sometimes we're so intimidated by people who are really good at things. Say, well, I can't paint, I can't do music, I can't write poetry because I can't get it published and so on. That's not the point. Or I can't garden because I can't win any awards. You don't do it to win an award, to get published. You do it to set your spirit free. First of all, don't write poetry to get it published. Write it for free sense. Write it to set your spirit free. Don't garden to try to make a living with it unless you're a professional gardener and you need to win a prize at the fair. No, do it because it feels good, because it sets you free. You don't have to be a musician who's published. You don't have to be a painter who's sold and had an exhibit. Paint because you love it, because it sets your spirit free. And see, we're always so intimidated by, but I'll never sell it, and I'm not good enough. That's not the point. That's Stafford's point. Said, lower your standards. Do it for Sabbath. Do it for enjoyment. I want to talk a little bit about guilt. I said I'd come back to it, and I will. We struggle with guilt. And I said, oftentimes we blame it on our religious training. Catholic guilt, Presbyterian guilt, Protestant guilt, Buddhist guilt. No. Partly guilt is innate. It's an innate and a healthy response inside of us. And it's done away with by sacrifice. Let me give you an example. There's a reflex thing, and it's a healthy reflex thing. If somebody comes and gives you a gift, a genuine gift, and a genuine gift is precisely, it's undeserved. Somebody who really doesn't owe you anything comes and gives you a present. What's your first response? Your first response is, no, I can't take that. And actually, that's healthy. That's healthy. That's much healthier than say, where you been with that? See, your first reaction is, no, I can't take this. The person says, no, I want you to have it. See, so that the gift has to be given twice. The first time you try to give it back precisely because you say, no, you don't owe me a gift. Well, that's the whole point. I don't, but I want to give it to you. And then you take it, you try to give it back, but he doesn't take it back. He gives it to you, and then you can own it without guilt. Now, I want to take you into the great sacrifice that Abraham was going to make of Isaac. Okay, it's going to illustrate that. See, Abraham has been praying for a son for years and years and years. And now he's 100 years old in the text. I'm not sure how that all works out physically, but anyway. In Scripture, he's 100 years old and he's given Isaac. And then God says, take Isaac up in the mountain and sacrifice him. So Abraham's prepared to do that. He takes Isaac up on the mountain. They put the wood and stuff around. He ties up Isaac and he puts him on the altar and he's prepared to sacrifice him. That's all archetypal. It sounds horrible on the surface, okay? And God stops the sacrifice. He said, I don't want you to sacrifice your son. Take him, and here's a ram. Sacrifice the ram instead. Good psychologists will tell you, when Abraham came down the mountain, Isaac was truly his son. See, Isaac was a great gift from God. And in that gesture, I can't really do this. I don't want, and God says, no, God stops the sacrifice, he gives it back. It's the same dynamic as when somebody gives you a gift. Say, I can't take this from you. Have it back. Say, no, I want you to have it. The second time it's given to you, it's yours. But that's also the way we take guilt away. See, guilt is part of the innate guilt that we have, not the superego guilt. That's something else. But part of the innate guilt, it's a healthy, and it's inside of all peoples. It's not religious. It's there precisely as a sign of sensitive health, which means life and every breath and everything's a gift. And it's when we don't receive it as a gift, we begin to feel guilty about it. I remember once a priest giving a very, very simplistic but brilliant homily at our little parish on Christmas Day. Now, I don't know if he was ever schooled in psychology, but it sounded very simple. But after I studied lots of psychology, I realized it was a really good homily. It was Christmas Day, and he says, today's Christmas Day. And you're going to celebrate, you're going to have family dinners, and people are be opening presents and so on. He said, so it's good you came to church. And at least you gave 1 hour to God, and then you can go home and enjoy this. That's right. Or the same priest used to say, God gives you so many hours a week, you could give 1 hour back. You could come to church on Sunday. That's actually a lot of wisdom. Because you know what happens when we don't give it back? We don't enjoy, because then we take it as given. See, you have to try to give the gift back. You have to try to give give it away. And the root out of guilt is not through psychological counseling. The root out of guilt is through proper sacrifice. You know, you see that, you can study the history of that. The time of Jesus, you know, farmers, they would grow a crop, and then they would harvest the crop, and before they ate a morsel, they would take a few bushels, and they'd offer it in sacrifice to God, give it back. See, and then it's not that there's something superstitious about that. They're recognizing this is gift. Now I can enjoy the gift, you know. A friend of mine recently went salmon fishing with one of the elders, one of the native tribes, and he said they went out Sunday morning, and he went out with this elder, and he said it was a magnificent catch, and he brought it all into the boat. And then he said, now, Father, we got to pray. He said, before we could even take this back to shore. And then he made this beautiful prayer about thanking God. You know, this is a gift. This will feed some people. This is, you know. See, but before, or a little grace before meals, all of these they're so important. See, it's when we don't do that, then guilt starts building up inside of us because, and it should, because we're taking gift as something that's owed. And see, if you recognize and try to give it back, and that's why there's been in all history and all of every nation and tribe and so on, there's always the concept of sacrifice. You've got to give something back so that you can enjoy what you have. If you don't give it back, because otherwise we don't see the gift. Somebody once asked, said, is it a sin not to pray? You know, suppose you're a very sensitive Christian. Is it a sin not to say your morning prayers? Well, no. Prayer, it's never a sin not to pray because prayer is a gift. Okay? But you know what happens when you don't pray in the morning? You miss the morning. You don't offend God. God isn't offended like, Jennifer didn't pray this morning, you know. God isn't some petty tyrant. You know what happens when we don't pray? We end up missing our lives. Because then it's just we consume and we drink in and stuff and we never think. We don't realize it's a wonderful gift. And see, so the way out of guilt, the way out of the deep guilt that's always a struggle to enjoy is through sacrifice. You know, I look at my parents' generation. And they had to be because they were poor and they were immigrants and they struggled a lot, you know. They didn't always have a lot of stuff. But it's interesting, they had a wonderful capacity to also enjoy life. But they had a deep concept of sacrifice in their life. They never ate a meal without first praying. We often do. You know, we're too busy and distracted. Then we don't enjoy the meal because we don't have the sense that it's a gift, you know. And then we get some vague, inchoate feeling of guilt. I don't know, I feel guilty about living, you know. We aren't giving back. The root out of prayer, out of guilt, is sacrifice. Abraham, you know, he felt guilty about having a son at 100. He tried to give him back to God, and the giver always stops the sacrifice and gives it back to you. You don't owe me this gift, but I want you to have it. Then when you receive the gift the second time, you can receive it without guilt. I want to end with a little poem here by Harry Hellman. Was an oblate poet, dead now, was a wonderful man. I knew this man, he was one of my mentors, and it's called Caprice. Let's go back to the weather. Most days you don't notice that there is any until you fall in love and or sin, and then you see the clouds and you stare holes into heaven looking for Christ, when he's really at your shoulder looking for you, and in such great shape you'd never believe what he's been through. Then before you know how it happened, it's July or August again, and you have time to do what you should have been doing all your life, sitting or walking in the grass in bare feet and loving. For God's sakes, it doesn't matter how you begin, though if I had the choice, I would do it all over again. Then you're all petals once more until the storm breaks your heart, and the biggest piece goes to heaven and to hell with the weather. Amen.